The desperate plea. The growling in Mia's stomach had become unbearable. She curled her thin arms around herself, pressing against the small, ragged mattress that smelled of dust and mold. The air in the room was cold, the only warmth coming from the thin blanket she had clutched around her shoulders. At only 8 years old, Mia had learned to live with hunger. It was as familiar to her as the sound of Mrs. Carter's sharp voice or the rough feel of the splintered wooden floors beneath her bare feet. She hadn't eaten since yesterday morning. A single slice of stale bread and a few sips of lukewarm water had been all she was given. A punishment, Mrs. Carter had said, for spilling a glass of milk at breakfast. Mia didn't cry anymore. She had learned early on that tears changed nothing. Instead, she turned to the only thing that gave her comfort, her mother's photograph. Reaching under her pillow, she pulled out the creased, faded picture, running her small fingers over the smiling woman's face. "I miss you," she whispered. She barely remembered her mother's voice, only the soft hum of a lullaby that sometimes echoed in her dreams. The other kids in the shelter called her foolish for holding on to a photo of someone who would never come back. But she didn't care. She couldn't stay here anymore. Mia knew that running away was dangerous. The city was big and filled with people who didn't care about a little girl with no home. But she also knew that if she stayed, she might never get out. Her mother had once written her a letter. It was old, the ink fading, but she had memorized every word. "If anything ever happens, find Judge Benjamin Crawford. He will help you." Mia had no idea who he was, but she had seen the name before, on a letter Mrs. Carter had once thrown into the trash. It had looked important, stamped with an official seal. If he was powerful enough to send letters to Mrs. Carter, maybe he could help her. Her small fingers trembled as she reached for her worn-out backpack. She didn't have much to take with her, just a few treasures. The photo of her mother, her letter, a tiny notebook with drawings, and a stuffed rabbit with one missing eye. She had found the rabbit in a donation box months ago, and though it was old, it had quickly become her closest friend. Carefully, she stuffed everything inside the bag and tiptoed to the door. The shelter was eerily quiet, the only sound the distant dripping of a leaking pipe. The other children were asleep, curled up on their cots like she had been. She paused for a moment, staring at them. Some had been here longer than her. Some had tried to run before and had been dragged back, punished for daring to leave. Mia had to be different. With a deep breath, she turned the doorknob and slipped into the hallway. The wooden floor creaked beneath her small steps, and she froze, heart pounding. Nothing. Holding her breath, she moved quickly, past the empty kitchen with its locked cabinets, past the office where Mrs. Carter kept the files of all the children in the shelter, past the front door, where a heavy chain was looped across the handles. Her escape route was through the small window in the laundry room. She had studied it for weeks, memorizing how the latch could be pried open with a fork she had hidden under her mattress. She crept inside, her hands shaking as she pulled out the fork and wedged it under the rusty latch. Click. The window slid open. Her heart leaped as she climbed onto the washing machine, squeezing her small body through the narrow opening. The moment her feet touched the ground outside, a rush of cold air hit her. She was free. For the first time in her life, she had made a choice for herself. She started running, her small legs carrying her through the darkened streets. She had no idea where the courthouse was, but she would find it. Judge Benjamin Crawford was her only hope, and she refused to let it slip away. The courtroom intrusion. Mia had never felt so small in her life. The courthouse loomed before her like a stone fortress, its tall pillars stretching into the sky. The city was waking up around her. Men in suits clutching coffee cups rushed past. Women in high heels clicked across the pavement, and officers in uniform stood near the entrance, their hands resting on their belts. Mia swallowed hard. She had never been in a place like this before. Her clothes were filthy, her hair tangled from the wind, and her backpack felt heavier than ever. Every part of her screamed that she didn't belong here. But she couldn't turn back now. Her mother's words echoed in her mind. "Find Judge Benjamin Crawford. He will help you." Mia clutched her backpack tightly and took a deep breath before stepping forward. She slipped inside the courthouse, unnoticed among the crowd of busy adults. The inside was even more intimidating than the outside. Polished floors, marble walls, and the sharp scent of paperwork and coffee. The air buzzed with urgency. She looked around, her wide brown eyes scanning the directory on the wall. There it was, Courtroom 3, Judge Benjamin Crawford. She followed the hallway, her small feet making almost no sound against the cold floor. Lawyers in dark suits hurried past her, their conversations a blur. No one paid her any attention. Her heart pounded. She didn't know what she would say when she saw the judge. Would he believe her? Would he even care? She reached the heavy double doors of Courtroom 3 and hesitated. A woman in a crisp blazer stood beside the entrance, glancing at her phone. Mia took a deep breath and stepped forward. "I need to see the judge," she said, her voice small but determined. The woman blinked, looking down at her. "Excuse me." "Judge Crawford," Mia repeated, gripping the strap of her backpack. "I need to see him. It's important." The woman's eyebrows furrowed. "Sweetheart, do you have a guardian with you? You can't just walk into a courtroom." Mia's chest tightened. If they sent her away now, she would never get another chance. So she did the only thing she could think of. She ran. Darting past the woman's outstretched arm, she pushed through the courtroom doors. The room was massive, filled with rows of benches where serious-looking people sat in silence. At the front, a long wooden table separated the lawyers from the towering judge's bench where he sat. Judge Benjamin Crawford. Mia didn't know what she expected, but he looked different from the cold, distant man she had imagined. His silver-streaked hair was neatly combed back, and his blue eyes were sharp as they scanned the room. His presence alone commanded respect. She barely had time to take it all in before someone shouted, "Hey, you can't be in here." Gasps filled the courtroom as heads turned in her direction. Mia's heart pounded, but she forced herself to move forward, stumbling into the center of the room. "Please," she cried, her voice shaking. "Your Honor, I need your help." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Judge Crawford narrowed his eyes, tapping his gavel once against the wooden bench. "Order," he said firmly, silencing the whispers. His gaze settled on Mia. "And who are you, young lady?" Mia's lip trembled. She hadn't expected him to speak directly to her. She took a shaky breath. My name is Mia," she said, "and I'm starving. Please help me." The room fell into stunned silence. For a moment, no one moved. Then a uniformed bailiff stepped forward. "Judge, I can remove her." "No," Crawford interrupted, raising a hand. His expression was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes, something that made Mia's heart race. He studied her, his fingers tightening around the gavel. "Who sent you here?" Mia hesitated. Her fingers fumbled with her backpack. Before she could speak, the hunger and exhaustion overwhelmed her. The edges of her vision blurred, and her knees buckled. She collapsed. The last thing she heard before darkness took her was the sound of rushing footsteps and the sharp clatter of something falling from her backpack onto the courtroom floor. A piece of paper fluttered to the ground. A letter. Addressed to Judge Benjamin Crawford. A letter from the past. The silence in the courtroom was deafening. Judge Benjamin Crawford stared at the crumpled letter in his trembling hands, his sharp blue eyes moving over the words as if trying to decipher a foreign language. He knew this handwriting. He had seen it before, years ago. The ink was faded, the paper worn from being folded and unfolded too many times. But there was no mistaking the name at the bottom. Emma Crawford. His daughter. Benjamin felt something constrict in his chest. A cold, paralyzing sensation he hadn't felt in decades. He had spent years perfecting a mask of composure, ruling over his courtroom with fairness and discipline. But now, with this single piece of paper, his entire world had cracked open. He could feel the weight of every eye in the room. Lawyers, officers, jury members, all watching, waiting for his reaction. But he barely registered them. His gaze slowly lifted from the paper to the frail little girl standing before him. Her clothes were too big for her small frame. Her dark hair was tangled, her face pale with exhaustion. But it was her eyes that struck him the most. They were Emma's eyes. The same deep brown, filled with the same quiet defiance. His throat tightened. Where did you get this?" he asked, his voice quieter than it had ever been in this courtroom. Mia's fingers curled into the straps of her backpack. "It was my mom's," she whispered. "She told me to find you if I ever needed help." A sharp pang shot through Benjamin's chest. Emma. He had spent years trying to forget her, to push down the guilt, the regret, the mistakes he had made. But the past had a cruel way of catching up. He swallowed hard. "Where is your mother now?" Mia hesitated. The courtroom was so quiet she could hear her own heartbeat. Then, with a voice so small it barely reached the front row, she whispered, "She's gone." A hushed murmur rippled through the crowd. Some of the jurors exchanged glances, the prosecutor shifted uncomfortably, and even the bailiff, who had been standing like a statue, let out a slow breath. Judge Crawford's grip on the letter tightened. Gone. Emma was gone. The word hit him like a physical blow, sending a sharp ache through his chest. He had spent so many years convincing himself that his absence from her life had been necessary, that she was better off without him. But now, standing before him, was proof of his failure. A hungry, exhausted child. His granddaughter. And he had never even known she existed. Benjamin forced himself to take a deep breath, steadying the tremor in his hands. He had to focus. "Mia," he said, his voice rougher than before. "Where have you been living?" Mia hesitated. She wasn't sure how much she should say. She had spent too long learning to survive in silence. Speaking up usually led to trouble, but something about the way the judge was looking at her made her feel different. Like maybe, just maybe, he actually wanted to listen. "In a shelter," she finally admitted. "Mrs. Carter's Home for Children." Benjamin's jaw clenched. He knew that name. The shelter had a reputation, one that made his stomach churn. It wasn't the first time he had seen cases of mistreatment coming from that place. "And why did you run away?" Mia lowered her head, shifting on her feet. "Because I was hungry," she mumbled. "I hadn't eaten since yesterday morning. Mrs. Carter said I wasn't allowed to." A wave of stunned silence spread through the courtroom. Benjamin's grip on the gavel tightened. He had seen many injustices in his years on the bench, but the idea of a child, his grandchild, being starved as a form of punishment filled him with a kind of fury he hadn't felt in years. He turned to the bailiff. "Get someone from Child Protective Services in here now." The bailiff nodded and rushed out of the room. Mia watched the judge carefully, unsure of what to think. He was angry, but not at her. He was angry for her. No one had ever done that before. Benjamin looked back at her, his expression softer now. "You did the right thing coming here," he said. "You're safe now." Mia didn't know how to respond. No one had ever said those words to her before. Safe. She wanted to believe it, but part of her was still waiting for someone to drag her away, to tell her that this had all been a mistake. Then, slowly, Benjamin placed the letter down on his desk. "Miss Thompson," he said, turning to his court clerk, a middle-aged woman who had worked beside him for years. "Clear my afternoon schedule." The clerk's eyebrows shot up. "Sir?" "I said clear my schedule," he repeated. Then he looked back at Mia. "I have something more important to take care of." Mia's breath caught in her throat. This was real. He wasn't turning her away. He wasn't sending her back. For the first time since she had arrived, she felt a spark of something unfamiliar in her chest. Hope. As the courtroom slowly returned to motion, people whispering, officers making calls, CPS being notified, Maya stood in the center of it all, clutching her backpack like a lifeline. She had come here looking for help. And maybe, just maybe, she had found it. A father's sins. Judge Benjamin Crawford sat in his chambers, staring at the faded letter on his desk. The sounds of the courthouse buzzed faintly outside his office, but he didn't hear them. His mind was trapped in the past. Emma, the daughter he had turned his back on, the girl who had needed him. And now, she was gone. His throat tightened as he rubbed his temples, exhaustion washing over him. His hands, so steady in the courtroom, now trembled slightly as he reached for the letter again. The words written in Emma's delicate, looping script burned into his memory. If anything ever happens, find Judge Benjamin Crawford. He will help you. He let out a shaky breath. She had trusted him. Even after everything, after years of silence and absence, she had still believed that, deep down, he would do the right thing. And he had failed her. A knock at the door snapped him out of his thoughts. He cleared his throat, straightened his posture, and forced his usual commanding expression back into place. "Come in," he said. The door creaked open, and Mia stepped inside. She looked small in the oversized courthouse chair, her tiny hands gripping the armrests like she was afraid the world would swallow her whole. For the first time in his life, Benjamin didn't know what to say. He had presided over thousands of cases, sent criminals to prison, made decisions that affected lives and families. And yet, sitting across from this child, his granddaughter, he felt powerless. "Mia," he started, his voice softer than before. "I want to help you, but I need you to tell me everything. Can you do that?" Mia hesitated, shifting uncomfortably. She wasn't used to talking about herself. Most adults didn't listen when she did. But this was different. He had stopped the entire courtroom for her. He had called CPS for her. And now he was sitting here, looking at her like he actually cared. So she took a deep breath and nodded. "I lived with my mom until the accident," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "She worked a lot, so we didn't have much, but she always made sure I had food and bedtime stories." Benjamin's chest ached at the mention of Emma. He had never known what kind of mother she had become. But hearing Maya's words, he knew she had been a good one. Maya swallowed, gripping the hem of her shirt. "After she was gone, I had to go live in the shelter. They said no one wanted me, that no one was looking for me." Benjamin clenched his fists. No one wanted her. No one was looking for her. He had spent decades convincing himself that he had done the right thing by staying out of Emma's life, that she was better off without him. But now, hearing Mia say those words that no child should ever have to say, he realized just how deeply he had been lying to himself. "And Mrs. Carter," he pressed gently, "she wouldn't let you eat." Mia hesitated, then nodded. She said food was a privilege. If we messed up, we didn't get to eat. A sharp fury burned in Benjamin's chest. He had seen many injustices in his time as a judge, but the thought of someone starving a child, his grandchild, was something he couldn't stomach. "She can't get away with that," he said firmly. "I won't let her." Mia blinked up at him, confusion flickering across her face. "Why?" she asked softly. Benjamin frowned. "What do you mean?" "Why do you care?" she whispered. "Nobody ever has before." The words hit him harder than any verdict he had ever given. Why? Because he had already failed once. Because he had already lost one person he loved. And because he refused to lose another. He took a slow breath and leaned forward, his sharp blue eyes locking onto hers. "Because I should have been there for your mother," he admitted, his voice heavy with regret. "And I won't make the same mistake twice." Mia studied him for a long moment, as if trying to decide if he was telling the truth. And for the first time in years, Benjamin found himself hoping that he was. Hours later, a shelter in chaos. Benjamin strode through the dimly lit halls of Mrs. Carter's home for children, his polished shoes echoing against the old tile floors. He wasn't alone. 2 social workers, A police officer and an investigator from the Department of Child Welfare followed closely behind. The moment he had spoken to CPS, the wheels had been set in motion. Calls were made. Warrants were issued. And now, standing in the place where Mia had suffered, he could feel his fury simmering just beneath the surface. The air smelled of mildew and overcooked food. The walls were lined with peeling paint, and the children who lived here stared at the unfamiliar group of adults with wary, tired eyes. They had seen this before. People came, they asked questions, and then they left. Nothing ever changed. Not this time. Mrs. Carter, a sharp-faced woman in her late 50s, stormed down the hall, her heels clicking angrily against the floor. "What is the meaning of this?" she snapped, folding her arms. The police officer beside Benjamin didn't flinch. "We have a warrant to inspect the premises." Mrs. Carter's lips thinned. "On what grounds?" "Mistreatment and neglect," the social worker replied. "There have been reports of children being denied food as punishment." Mrs. Carter scoffed. "That's ridiculous. These are troubled children. They lie." Benjamin stepped forward, his presence alone enough to make the woman hesitate. "Are you calling my granddaughter a liar?" he asked coldly. Mrs. Carter paled. Granddaughter," she stammered. "Mia Crawford," he said, enunciating every syllable. "The child you starved and abandoned." Mrs. Carter's face turned an alarming shade of red, but before she could speak, the social worker held up a hand. "We'll be conducting interviews with every child here," she said firmly. "If we find any signs of abuse, this facility will be shut down immediately." Benjamin didn't need to hear the interviews to know the truth. He had already made his decision. Mrs. Carter would never have power over another child again. And Maya would never have to be hungry or afraid again. Later that night, a new beginning. Mia sat in the back seat of Benjamin's car, staring out the window as the city lights passed by. She still wasn't sure if this was real. She had spent so long surviving, expecting disappointment, that she wasn't sure what to do now. But then she felt something warm. Benjamin had placed a soft, thick blanket over her shoulders. "It's going to be okay," he said quietly. And for the first time in her life, she almost believed it. A new home. Mia sat in the back seat of the sleek black car, staring out the window as the city lights blurred past. The weight of the day pressed heavily on her small shoulders. She had never felt this exhausted before, not just physically, but in a way that seeped deep into her bones. She was leaving the shelter. She should have been relieved, but all she could feel was uncertainty. Judge Crawford had barely spoken since they left. He had made a few calls, his voice calm and authoritative, arranging things with the people from CPS. Now the only sound in the car was the faint hum of the engine and the distant honking of city traffic. Mia clutched her worn-out backpack to her chest, her fingers gripping the straps tightly. Everything she owned was inside. The only things she had left of her mother. Would they take that away from her too? The car slowed as they turned onto a quiet street lined with tall trees and grand houses with neatly trimmed lawns. It didn't look anything like the places Mia had known. No flickering streetlights, no crumbling sidewalks, no shouting in the distance. Everything here was peaceful. Finally, the car pulled up in front of a massive house, far bigger than anything Mia had ever seen. It had tall windows and a grand staircase leading up to the front door, the kind of place that belonged in movies. Mia's stomach twisted. She didn't belong here. Judge Crawford stepped out of the car first, adjusting his coat as he moved toward the door. After a moment, he turned and held the door open for her. Mia hesitated. She had learned that help usually came with strings attached. People made promises they didn't keep. What if he changed his mind? What if he decided she was too much trouble? She tightened her grip on her backpack and forced herself to move. The inside of the house was even more overwhelming than the outside. High ceilings, expensive-looking furniture, and warm, golden lights filled the space. Everything was spotless, untouched, like a place no child had ever lived in. It didn't feel like a home. It felt like a museum. Mia's small, scuffed sneakers looked out of place against the polished floors. She stood frozen in the doorway, unsure of what to do. Benjamin noticed her hesitation. He cleared his throat, suddenly aware of how unfamiliar this must have been for her. "This is your home now," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "You can stay here as long as you want." Mia looked up at him, her brown eyes cautious. For how long? The question cut him deeper than he expected. She wasn't asking out of curiosity. She was asking because she had never had a home that lasted. His jaw tightened. "For as long as you need," he said firmly. Mia studied his face, searching for the lie. She didn't find one. Still, she didn't move from the doorway. Benjamin hesitated, then stepped forward and gestured toward the hallway. "Let me show you your room." Mia followed slowly, her small feet barely making a sound on the thick carpet. He led her to a bedroom near the end of the hall, pausing in front of the door before pushing it open. Mia's breath caught. The room was bigger than she had expected, with a soft-looking bed covered in a thick blue blanket. A window overlooked the quiet street, and against the far wall stood a bookshelf lined with colorful stories. There was a desk, a lamp, and even a small plush armchair in the corner. It wasn't fancy. It wasn't cold like the rest of the house. It felt warm, lived in. "Everything here is yours," Benjamin said, watching her carefully. "If there's anything else you need, we'll get it." Mia took a slow step inside. She ran her fingers over the wooden desk, half expecting it to disappear. No one had ever given her a space of her own before. She turned back to the judge. "Why are you doing this?" she asked quietly. Benjamin exhaled, running a hand over his face. He had asked himself the same question 100 times. Because he owed it to her mother. Because he had spent years pretending his past didn't exist. Because he had failed Emma, and this was the only way he knew how to make things right. But mostly, because when he had looked at Mia in that courtroom, starving and desperate, something inside him had shattered. Because she was his family. And for the first time in his life, he wasn't going to turn his back on that. Instead of answering, he simply said, "Because I want to." Mia wasn't sure if she believed him yet, but for the first time in a long time she wanted to. She dropped her backpack onto the bed and hesitated. "Can I keep my stuff?" she asked. Benjamin blinked. "Of course," he said, slightly startled. Mia slowly unzipped her bag, pulling out the photograph of her mother and the worn stuffed rabbit. She placed the photo carefully on the bedside table. Then, without looking at him, she whispered, "Thank you." Benjamin felt something loosen in his chest. "You're welcome," he said softly. Mia didn't know if she would ever truly belong here. But for now, it was enough. And maybe, just maybe, it was the beginning of something new. Later that night, Mia lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. She had expected sleep to come easily, but instead, her mind raced. What if this was temporary? What if he changed his mind? She had spent so long preparing for disappointment that she didn't know how to accept kindness. But then, through the quiet of the house, she heard footsteps outside her door. A shadow passed by, pausing just for a moment. Then she heard it. The soft click of a lock turning. Not locking her in. Locking everyone else out. Protecting her. Mia's chest tightened. Maybe, just maybe, she was safe. For the first time in her life. And as her tired eyes fluttered shut, the last thing she saw was her mother's photograph on the bedside table, smiling back at her. The unthinkable. The morning sun streamed through the curtains, casting a golden glow over Mia's new room. She blinked awake, momentarily confused. The bed beneath her was too soft, the air smelled too clean, and there was no sound of crying children or Mrs. Carter's sharp voice echoing down the hall. She sat up, gripping the edges of the blanket, her heartbeat quickening. It wasn't a dream. She was still here. The events of yesterday came rushing back. The courtroom, Judge Crawford, the letter, the ride to this enormous house. She had fallen asleep clutching her old stuffed rabbit, and now it lay beside her, looking oddly out of place in the neat, untouched room. Carefully, Mia swung her legs over the side of the bed and padded to the door. It wasn't locked. A lump formed in her throat. For so long, doors had been locked against her, to keep her trapped, to keep her controlled. But this one had been locked for her, to protect her. She peeked out into the hallway. The house was quiet. Hesitantly, she made her way toward the kitchen, following the faint sound of clinking dishes. Judge Crawford, Benjamin, was standing at the counter, pouring a cup of coffee. His silver hair was slightly tousled, and he wasn't wearing his usual suit. Instead, he had on a crisp white shirt with the sleeves rolled up, making him seem different, less like the intimidating judge she had met in the courtroom and more like Mia wasn't sure what. He turned when he noticed her, setting his cup down. "Good morning," he said simply. Mia shuffled awkwardly, unsure what to say. "You hungry?" he asked, motioning toward the kitchen table. The word hungry made her stomach twist. It was a strange thing. She was always hungry. But here, now, she wasn't sure if she was allowed to be. Benjamin must have noticed her hesitation because he sighed and moved to the stove. A plate was already sitting there, covered with a warm cloth. He lifted it, revealing scrambled eggs, toast, and fresh fruit. Mia's eyes widened. He pulled out a chair. "Sit." She hesitated. At the shelter, food came with conditions. You eat when you're told. You eat what you're given. If you misbehave, you don't eat at all. Mia lingered by the table, fingers gripping the back of the chair. Benjamin's voice was gentler now. "Mia, you don't have to ask for food here." She swallowed hard. "I don't." "No." He slid the plate in front of her. "You eat when you're hungry. Always." Something inside Mia cracked. She climbed into the chair, picking up the fork with shaky fingers. The first bite sent warmth through her entire body. She ate slowly, half expecting someone to snatch the plate away, to tell her she had taken too much. But Benjamin simply sipped his coffee, watching her without judgment. When she finally set her fork down, her stomach full for the first time in what felt like forever, Benjamin leaned forward. "I need to ask you something," he said. Mia tensed. Here it was, the catch. The part where he told her what she had to do in exchange for food, for shelter, for kindness. But his next words surprised her. "Would you like to stay here? Not just for now, but for good." Mia's eyes widened. "Stay," she echoed, as if she didn't quite understand the meaning of the word. Benjamin nodded. "I've spoken with the social workers. Given your circumstances, I can file for permanent guardianship, if you'd like that." Mia's heartbeat pounded in her ears. A home. A real home. Not just a temporary bed in a crowded shelter, not just another stop on the endless cycle of foster homes. But this place with soft beds and warm food and a man who looked at her like she was something more than just another burden. She wanted to say yes. She wanted to scream it. But years of disappointment had taught her not to trust too quickly. "What if you don't want me later?" she whispered. Benjamin's expression hardened, like the very idea offended him. "That's not going to happen." Mia hesitated. "But what if I mess up? What if I do something wrong?" He exhaled, setting his coffee down with a quiet clink. "You'll mess up," he admitted. "You'll have bad days. So will I. But that doesn't mean I'll stop wanting you here." Mia's throat tightened. No one had ever said anything like that to her before. She stared at him, searching for any sign of dishonesty, any hint that this was another promise that would eventually be broken. But he just sat there, patient, waiting. Like he meant it. Mia's fingers curled into the fabric of her shirt. Slowly, cautiously, she nodded. "Okay," she whispered. A small smile flickered across Benjamin's face, the first real smile she had seen from him. "Good," he said. "Then we'll start the paperwork today." Mia didn't fully understand what that meant, but for the first time in her life, she felt something unfamiliar settle in her chest. Not fear, not anxiety, something else. Hope. Months later, a home, not a house. The months that followed were a whirlwind of change. Mia officially became Mia Crawford. Her name was added to legal documents, but more importantly, it was written on the mailbox outside the house, on the school forms Benjamin signed, and on the invitations to birthday parties she never thought she'd have. She had new clothes, a backpack that wasn't falling apart, a toothbrush that belonged only to her. But the biggest change wasn't the physical things. It was the fact that every morning when she woke up, she didn't have to wonder where she would sleep that night. She didn't have to be afraid of locked doors or empty stomachs. She had routines, piano lessons, Saturday movie nights, arguments about bedtime, and long conversations at the dinner table. She had family. One evening, as she sat curled up on the couch with a book, Benjamin walked in, setting a hot chocolate down beside her. "Big test tomorrow?" he asked, glancing at the open textbook beside her. Mia nodded. "Yeah. You ready for it?" "I think so." She hesitated, then looked up at him. "Will you come if I win the class competition?" Benjamin raised an eyebrow. "Are you planning on winning?" Mia smirked. "Obviously." His lips twitched. "Then I'll be there." She grinned, picking up her hot chocolate. Benjamin watched her for a moment, then sighed. "You know," he said casually, "you don't have to keep calling me Judge Crawford." Mia blinked. "I don't." "No." He cleared his throat. "You can just call me Benjamin." Mia hesitated. Then, very softly, she asked, "What about Grandpa?" Benjamin froze. For a moment, he couldn't speak. Then he smiled. A real full smile. "I think that would be just fine," he said. And for the first time in both of their lives, they were exactly where they were meant to be. Together. A family rebuilt. Mia sat on the front porch, watching the autumn leaves swirl around the driveway. It had been months since she had stepped into Judge Benjamin Crawford's courtroom, desperate and starving. Months since she had taken that first hesitant step into his house, her home. She still wasn't used to calling it that. Even now, some nights she woke up expecting to find herself back in the shelter, the harsh voice of Mrs. Carter echoing in her ears. But when she opened her eyes, the ceiling was still high above her bed was still warm, and her mother's photograph was still beside her. It was real. She was really here. The sound of a car pulling into the driveway made her turn. Benjamin, her grandfather, stepped out, his sharp blue eyes immediately finding her. "You're home early," she said, closing her notebook. He nodded. "Court ended sooner than expected. Thought I'd pick up dinner on the way." Mia raised an eyebrow. "You got takeout?" Benjamin gave her a dry look. "I'm perfectly capable of ordering food, Mia." She grinned. "Yeah, but are you capable of remembering that I don't like mushrooms?" Benjamin sighed, walking up the steps and ruffling her hair as he passed. "You'll survive." She laughed, following him inside. Over the months, their relationship had grown into something neither of them had expected. At first, it had been awkward. Neither of them knew what to do with each other. Benjamin had lived alone for years, comfortable in his quiet, structured life. Mia had spent most of her life learning to keep her head down and stay out of trouble. But little by little, things changed. Mia started leaving her backpack by the front door instead of keeping it packed, ready to run. She started eating without looking over her shoulder, waiting for someone to tell her she'd had enough. Benjamin started noticing the small things, like how she scrunched her nose when she was concentrating, or how she always left the last bite of her sandwich untouched because she had been taught to save food in case she didn't get another meal later. And most importantly, he learned that Maya was fiercely independent, but still longed for reassurance. She wouldn't ask for hugs, but she wouldn't pull away if he put a hand on her shoulder. She wouldn't ask him to stay up when she had nightmares, but she would leave her door cracked open just a little, just enough to hear his footsteps down the hall. They had become a family in the quiet moments, over shared breakfasts, over Saturday movie nights, over evenings spent arguing about whether or not hot chocolate was an acceptable substitute for dinner. And now, standing in the kitchen, Benjamin watched Mia with a strange feeling in his chest. Pride. "You have homework?" he asked as he pulled out plates. "Did it already," she said, grabbing the silverware. "Math was easy. English was kind of boring. Oh, and I got a 98 on my science test." Benjamin raised an eyebrow. "Only 98. Mia grinned. Yeah, I know. You'll expect a perfect score next time, Your Honor." He smirked. "Glad we understand each other." They ate dinner at the kitchen table, just the two of them. It was a simple thing, but to Mia, it meant everything. She didn't have to eat quickly, afraid the food would be taken away. She didn't have to sit in silence, ignored and invisible. Here, she had a voice. She had a place. She had someone. After dinner, she grabbed her notebook and curled up in the armchair in the living room, while Benjamin read through a case file at his desk. It had become their routine, both of them lost in their own work, comfortable in the same space. Eventually, Benjamin stretched and glanced at the clock. "It's late. You should head to bed." Mia yawned, but made no move to get up. "Just a few more minutes." He gave her a knowing look. She pouted. "Grandpa, please." His expression softened. Months ago, the word grandpa had been foreign to both of them. But now, he had grown to love the way she said it, like it meant something, like he meant something. He sighed, shaking his head. "Fine. 10 more minutes." Mia grinned. "You're the best." Benjamin rolled his eyes but didn't argue. Because deep down, he knew this was exactly where he was meant to be. And for the first time in his life, he wasn't just a judge. He was a father, a grandfather, a family. And that was all that mattered.